The Vietnam veteran's final confession. Subscribe for more unbelievable true stories that will leave you questioning everything you thought you knew. When Katie picked up her phone that day, she immediately noticed something different about her grandfather's expression. The 72-year-old man had always been strong, but lying in that hospital bed, he looked like he wanted to lift a 50-year burden from his shoulders. Robert's hand began trembling. As Katie started recording, the old man took a deep breath and began speaking. His first sentence made Katie's blood run cold. Robert wasn't the Robert everyone knew. His real name was Thomas, and he'd been living under someone else's identity for 50 years. Under the cold hospital lights, Robert's eyes filled with tears. He was only 19 when they shipped him to Vietnam. No family, nobody. Joining the army was his escape route. But the realities of war caught him unprepared. What he saw and lived through in that first month shook him to his core. He met Robert in his third month. The real Robert Mitchell was a rich family's son, Yale graduate, volunteered for the army. The two young men quickly became friends. Robert's family regularly sent letters, packages. Thomas had nobody. That cursed night changed everything. The Viet Cong attack started suddenly. Thomas and Robert were in the same foxhole. The place turned into hell. Bullets whistling through the air, bombs exploding. When Robert stood up, Thomas tried to warn him, but it was too late. The sniper's bullet pierced Robert's chest. When Thomas held Robert in his arms, his friend was taking his last breaths. Robert's hand gripped Thomas's arm, and he whispered. He wanted him to take care of his family, make them happy. Then his eyes closed. But the truly shocking part hadn't even begun yet. When the attack ended, Thomas was in shock. Robert's body lay beside him. The thought that came to his mind at that moment frightened even him. Nobody knew them closely. They both had similar physical features. Thomas had no identity. Robert had one. Katie's hands trembled as she held the camera. What her grandfather, or rather Thomas, was telling her was unbelievable. The old man continued. He explained how that night he took Robert's dog tags, placed his own identity on the corpse. When morning came, everyone thought Thomas had died, and Robert was wounded. While recovering on the hospital ship, he constantly tried to act like Robert. He read the Mitchell family's letters, tried to memorize Robert's life. As he counted days until going home, the guilt inside grew, but there was no turning back now. When he returned to America, the Mitchell family met him at the airport. Robert's mother, Helen, started crying when she saw him. Thomas understood at that moment that this family truly loved him. Robert's father, James, considered it normal that his son returned changed from war. The first months were hard. Thomas constantly looked at Robert's photographs, tried to imitate his behaviors. Fortunately, war trauma explained why everyone found him acting differently. Nobody suspected. But right at this point, everything became even more complicated. The Mitchell family owned one of Connecticut's largest construction companies. They expected Robert to take over the business. Thomas knew nothing about construction, but he learned. He studied day and night, reading every book Robert had left behind. Within a year, he was running board meetings. Then he met Sarah. She was James's business partner's daughter, and according to family stories, Robert had been in love with her since high school. Sarah noticed something different about him but attributed it to the war. When she kissed him for the first time, Thomas felt like the worst person in the world. He was stealing another man's entire life. But here's where the story takes an even darker turn. They got married 2 years later. The whole town came to the wedding. Robert's mother, Helen, cried with joy, saying her son had finally found happiness after the war. Thomas stood at the altar knowing he was living a complete lie. Sarah looked at him with such love that his heart broke. Their first child was born a year later. They named him Robert Jr., after his father. When Thomas held his son for the first time, he sobbed uncontrollably. Everyone thought it was joy, but it was crushing guilt. This child would never know his real father's identity. The nightmares started getting worse. Every night, Thomas saw Robert's face. Sometimes Robert would ask him why he stole his life. Other times, Robert would thank him for taking care of his family. Thomas started drinking heavily to sleep. One night, drunk and desperate, he almost confessed everything to Sarah. He got as far as saying he had something important to tell her. But when he saw the fear in her eyes, he stopped. Instead, he told her about a fictitious war trauma. Sarah held him while he cried, not knowing she was comforting an imposter. Katie paused the recording for a moment. Her grandfather needed water. As she helped him drink, she noticed how frail he'd become. This confession was taking everything out of him, but he seemed determined to continue. You won't believe what happened next. Thomas continued his story. 5 years into the marriage, he received a letter that made his blood freeze. It was from someone claiming to be Thomas's sister, but Thomas had no family, or so everyone believed. The letter said she'd been searching for him for years, that their mother was dying and wanted to see him one last time. The return address was from Oregon. Thomas burned the letter immediately, but more came, each one more desperate than the last. His sister Martha explained how the family had lost touch with him when he joined the army, how they'd been told he died in Vietnam, but she never believed it. Thomas was trapped. If he responded, his cover would be blown. If he didn't, this woman might investigate further. He chose silence, but the guilt of denying a dying woman her son ate at him. Meanwhile, the Mitchell family business flourished under his leadership. James often said Robert had become a better businessman than he ever imagined. The irony burnt. Thomas was succeeding at being Robert better than Robert might have himself. Sarah noticed his increasing anxiety. She suggested therapy, but Thomas refused. How could he tell a therapist the truth? He started having panic attacks during family gatherings, especially when they'd look through old photo albums. Robert's childhood pictures felt like accusations. The children grew up calling him Dad, believing his stories about Yale, about growing up in Connecticut. He taught them to throw a baseball the way he imagined Robert would have. Every birthday, every Christmas, every Father's Day was another knife in his conscience. Hold on, because what comes next will leave you speechless. 20 years into living as Robert, Thomas received news that shattered him. A Vietnam veteran named Carlos contacted him. Carlos had served in their unit. He wanted to reunite with his old war buddies. Carlos mentioned he'd been there the night Thomas died, remembered how devastated Robert had been. Thomas met Carlos at a coffee shop, terrified of being exposed, but Carlos was nearly blind from diabetes. He couldn't see Thomas clearly, just heard his voice. They talked for hours about the war, about fallen friends. Carlos mentioned how Thomas had been a good kid, how sad it was he had no family to mourn him. That night, Thomas went to a church for the first time in 20 years. He knelt in an empty pew and sobbed. He wanted to confess but couldn't. Too many lives would be destroyed. Sarah, the children, Robert's parents who were now in their 70s, and thought their son was taking care of them. He started writing everything down in a journal, hiding it in the attic. If something happened to him, maybe someday someone would find it and know the truth. But years passed, and the journal remained hidden. Robert's father, James, died when Thomas was 45. On his deathbed, James held Thomas's hand and said he was proud of the man his son had become. Thomas wanted to confess right then, but James's peaceful smile stopped him. Let the old man die believing his son survived the war. The weight of the secret grew heavier with age. Thomas developed insomnia, high blood pressure, anxiety disorders. Doctors attributed it to delayed PTSD from Vietnam. Sarah stood by him through everything, never knowing she was married to a stranger. But wait until you hear what happened just last year. Helen, Robert's mother, was now 92 and in a nursing home with dementia. Thomas visited her every week. Most days she didn't recognize him, but one afternoon she grabbed his hand with surprising strength. She looked directly into his eyes and said, "You're not my Robert, are you?" Thomas's heart stopped. But then Helen smiled and said, "You're the angel God sent to replace him. I knew my boy died in that war, but you came back to take care of us. Thank you." She died 2 days later, taking her knowledge, real or imagined, to the grave. The secret had been eating Thomas alive for 5 decades. His health deteriorated rapidly after Helen's death. The doctors found cancer throughout his body. They gave him 3 months. That's when he decided Katie needed to know the truth. Katie was crying now, as her grandfather continued. She'd grown up idolizing him, this war hero, this successful businessman, this loving grandfather. Finding out he was someone else entirely felt like losing him twice. Thomas reached for a manila envelope on the bedside table. Inside were 2 things that made Katie gasp. The first was Thomas's real dog tags, hidden for 50 years. The second was something even more shocking. Here's the part that changes everything. It was a photograph from Vietnam. 2 young soldiers, arms around each other's shoulders, smiling. Thomas pointed to the man on the left. That was him, the real Thomas. Then he pointed to the man on the right, the real Robert Mitchell. But Katie recognized that face. It was the face of a homeless veteran she'd been helping at the shelter where she volunteered. The man who called himself Tom, who said he had no family, who suffered from severe amnesia. Thomas's eyes widened when Katie told him. It was impossible. He'd held Robert as he died. He'd seen the blood, felt his last breath. But Katie pulled out her phone, showed him a picture she'd taken at the shelter last week. The resemblance was undeniable. Much older, weathered, damaged, but it could be Robert Mitchell. Thomas began hyperventilating. If Robert was alive, then whose body did they bury as Thomas? Whose family never got closure? Katie called the shelter immediately. Tom was still there. She asked him if he remembered anything about Vietnam, about being shot. Tom's voice over the speaker was shaky. He said he only remembered waking up in a North Vietnamese field hospital, prisoner for 2 years, then decades of confusion, assumed names, no memory of who he really was. The truth nobody expected was about to surface. Thomas insisted on seeing him. Despite the doctor's protests, Katie drove him to the shelter. When they walked in, Tom was sitting by the window. He looked up, and for a moment neither man moved. Then Tom stood up slowly. He walked toward Thomas, studying his face. His hand reached out, trembling, and touched the scar on Thomas's neck. A scar Thomas had gotten trying to save Robert that night. "Tommy?" Tom whispered. "Tommy, is that you?" Thomas collapsed. The weight of 50 years of lies, of living another man's life, of believing he'd caused his friend's death, everything came crashing down. Tom, the real Robert, held him as he sobbed. Robert's memory began returning in fragments. The bullet hadn't killed him. He'd been captured, tortured, forgotten who he was. By the time he was released years later, he believed his name was Tom. No memory of his family, his life, anything before the camps. He'd lived on the streets for decades, a ghost of a man everyone thought was dead. Meanwhile, Thomas had lived his life, raised his children, loved his wife. The cruelest irony of war had switched their fates. But here's what will really blow your mind. Katie was recording everything. Two old men, both victims of a war that had stolen their identities in different ways. Robert didn't want his life back. Too much time had passed. The family Thomas had raised was Thomas's family now. Robert had no connection to them, but Thomas was dying. 3 months, the doctors said, maybe less. Robert looked at his old friend, the man who'd carried the burden of his identity for half a century, and made a decision that shocked everyone. Robert said he would take back his name just long enough to give Thomas peace. He would tell the family that Thomas had saved his life in Vietnam, that Thomas was a hero who deserved to be remembered. He wouldn't expose the switch. Thomas could die as Robert Mitchell, the identity he'd worn so long it had become real. Sarah arrived at the shelter, confused why her dying husband had insisted on coming here. When Thomas introduced her to Robert, calling him an old war buddy named Tom, she saw something in both men's eyes but didn't understand what. The three of them sat together as the sun set. Two men who'd traded lives without meaning to, and a woman who'd loved one while believing he was the other. The truth was too complex, too painful, too late to fully unravel. The most heartbreaking moment was yet to come. Over the next weeks, Robert visited Thomas in the hospital daily. They talked about Vietnam, about the life Thomas had lived, about the family he'd raised. Robert showed no resentment. Instead, he thanked Thomas for giving his parents happiness, for being the son they needed. Thomas's children came to visit, and Robert met them as Tom, their father's war buddy. He saw Sarah's love for Thomas, saw the successful, kind children they'd raised. The grandchildren called Thomas Grandpa with such affection that Robert knew Thomas had been a better Robert Mitchell than he ever could have been. One evening, Thomas asked Robert for forgiveness. Robert held his friend's hand and told him there was nothing to forgive. War had stolen both their lives in different ways. Thomas had survived by becoming Robert. Robert had survived by forgetting he ever was. Katie asked Robert if he wanted to reclaim his inheritance, his family's fortune. Robert laughed bitterly. What would he do with money now? He was 72, broken, alone by choice. The shelter was his home. The other veterans were his family. But then Robert made a request that stunned everyone. He wanted to die as Thomas. When his time came, he wanted to be buried under Thomas's name, the friend who'd supposedly died saving him in Vietnam. That way, Thomas could remain Robert Mitchell forever, even in death. The family would never know, history would never know, but the two friends would have fully traded places. The hospital room fell silent. Thomas was crying again, but these were different tears. Tears of gratitude, of relief, of a burden finally shared. The man he thought he'd killed was alive and offering him absolution in the most complete way possible. Sarah held her husband's hand, still not understanding the full weight of what she was witnessing. She thought these were just two old veterans saying goodbye. She had no idea she was watching two men finalizing a 5-decade identity swap. Katie stopped recording. Her grandfather, or the man she'd called grandfather, was fading. The confession had taken everything out of him, but there was peace in his eyes for the first time she could remember. Now here comes the final, shocking revelation. Thomas died 3 days later. His last words were, "Thank you, Robert." Sarah thought he was delirious, talking to himself. The family mourned Robert Mitchell, war hero, businessman, beloved father and grandfather. The entire town came to his funeral. Robert attended, standing in the back, unknown to everyone except Katie. When they lowered the casket, Robert saluted. Not Thomas, but the life he'd lived, the family he'd raised, the man Thomas had become by being him. A month after the funeral, Katie received a call. Robert had passed away in his sleep at the shelter. He'd left her a note. It contained a single line that revealed everything and nothing. "We both survived, just in each other's skin." Katie had him buried as Thomas, as he'd requested, a small military funeral with just her and a few veterans from the shelter. The headstone read, "Thomas, a true friend." No last name, no dates, just the simple truth neither man could tell while alive. But the story doesn't end there. Katie kept the recording. She struggled for months about what to do with it. Her grandmother Sarah was still alive. Her father and aunts and uncles believed their father was a war hero named Robert Mitchell. The truth would destroy everything they believed about their family. She decided to wait. Sarah was 70 and in good health. The truth could wait until after she passed. But Katie started visiting the graves. Both of them. The elaborate Mitchell family plot where Thomas lay as Robert, and the simple veteran's grave where Robert rested as Thomas. She would tell them both about the family, about how Sarah was doing, about how the grandchildren were growing up. Two men who'd lived, switched lives, now resting in switched graves, with only Katie knowing the complete truth. One day, while cleaning out her grandfather's belongings, Katie found the journal Thomas had hidden in the attic decades ago. Page after page of confession, guilt, love for a family he felt he'd stolen. The final entry, written the day before he told Katie everything, said simply, "The truth needs to be told, even if only to one person." And then Katie discovered something that changed the entire story one more time. In the very back of the journal, folded and yellowed, was a letter. It was dated 1 week after the night Thomas thought Robert had died. It was from Robert, written in a North Vietnamese prison. He was alive, confused, but alive. He begged Thomas to tell his family he was captured, not dead. The letter had been returned to sender, never reaching Thomas. The address was wrong. The military mail system in chaos. Robert had tried to reach out, tried to correct the mistake, but the letter had somehow ended up back with his personal effects, which Thomas had taken. Thomas had never known. For 50 years, he'd believed he'd stolen a dead man's identity. In reality, he'd accidentally lived the life of a man trying desperately to return to it. The guilt Thomas carried was based on a lie he never knew existed. Katie sat in her grandfather's empty house, holding this letter, understanding finally the complete tragedy. Two young men, destroyed by war in ways neither could have imagined. One living with unbearable guilt, the other with no memory. Both victims of a cruel cosmic mix-up that defined 5 decades of their lives. She made a decision. She would write a book, changing the names, the places, some details. It would be fiction based on truth. That way the story could be told without destroying her family. Thomas and Robert's strange journey could be known without revealing their real identities. But then something unexpected happened. As Katie researched for the book, she discovered something shocking. There were others. Other soldiers who'd returned from Vietnam with switched identities. Some by choice, some by confusion, some by accident. A hidden community of men living lives that weren't originally theirs. She found a support group online. Families who suspected their loved ones weren't who they claimed to be. Stories of dramatic personality changes after the war. Of knowledge gaps. Of memories that didn't match. Vietnam had scrambled more identities than anyone knew. Katie realized her grandfather's story wasn't unique. It was part of a larger tragedy. A generation of men so broken by war they became different people. Literally. Some, like Thomas, took other identities. Others, like Robert, forgot their own. She started interviewing these families, with their permission, anonymously. Each story was heartbreaking. Men who'd lived entire lives as someone else. Families who'd loved strangers. Children who'd never known their real father's names. The final twist will leave you stunned. 6 months after Thomas's death, Katie received a package, no return address, postmarked from Oregon. Inside was a photo album and a letter. The letter was from Martha, the woman who'd claimed to be Thomas's sister 40 years ago. Martha had been real. She'd been searching for her brother Thomas for 5 decades. She'd hired private investigators, contacted the military, never giving up hope. Somehow she'd found Katie's blog post about visiting 2 veterans' graves. The photo album contained pictures of the real Thomas's family, parents who'd died, hoping their son would return, siblings who'd grown old wondering what happened, a life Thomas had abandoned when he joined the army, thinking no one cared. Martha was 85 now, the last surviving member of Thomas's real family. She wanted to know what happened to her brother. Katie faced an impossible choice. Tell Martha her brother had lived as someone else and died 3 days ago, or that he'd died in Vietnam as history recorded. Katie chose a third option. She invited Martha to visit. She took her to both graves. At Thomas's official grave, she told Martha that her brother had died a hero, saving his friend Robert. At Robert's grave, she said Thomas lived on, in the life Robert had built because of his sacrifice. Martha understood more than Katie expected. She'd suspected something when her letters went unanswered 40 years ago. She touched both headstones and said, "He survived somehow, that's all that matters." And now the absolutely final revelation. Katie's father recently took a DNA test for fun, one of those ancestry websites. The results came back with a shocking match. He had a half-sister he'd never known about. The woman was 48, born in 1976, living in North Dakota. Her mother's name was Lisa. Katie found her in Thomas's journal mentioned only once. A nurse at the VA hospital where Thomas had been treated for PTSD in 1975. Thomas had written about a brief affair, his guilt, his immediate ending of it. This woman, Jennifer, was Thomas's biological daughter, which meant Katie's father and aunts and uncles were not Robert Mitchell's biological children. They were Thomas's. The man who'd lived as Robert had left his actual bloodline, while believing he was perpetrating a complete fraud. Jennifer had been searching for her biological father her whole life. Her mother had only known him as Robert Mitchell, the war veteran who'd been her patient. She'd never told him she was pregnant, not wanting to destroy his marriage. The DNA match revealed the final truth. Thomas had become Robert so completely that even his hidden mistakes were under Robert's name. His children were his children, but not Robert's. The bloodline had switched with the names. Katie met Jennifer. Another piece of the scattered puzzle. Jennifer looked like Thomas, the real Thomas from the old Vietnam photo. She had her father's eyes, his smile, a daughter who'd never known her father, who her father never knew existed. The two women sat together, sharing stories of a man neither fully knew. Katie told Jennifer about Thomas's confession, about the identity swap, about the guilt he'd carried. Jennifer cried for a father she'd never meet, who'd lived his entire life as someone else. They decided to keep the secret. Jennifer wouldn't claim any inheritance or disrupt the family. She just wanted to know where she came from, who her father was, even if he'd never been himself. But there's one last thing. A year after everything, Katie was cleaning out the shelter where Robert had lived. They were renovating, and she wanted to make sure nothing of his was thrown away. In his locker she found a small box. Inside was a Purple Heart medal. But it wasn't Robert Mitchell's. The name engraved was different. Joseph Parker. Another soldier, another name, another mystery. Had Robert been Joseph at some point during his lost decades? Or was this another soul lost in the confusion of war? Katie researched Joseph Parker. Killed in action, Vietnam, 1969. Same unit as Thomas and Robert. His body was never recovered. His family had buried an empty casket. But here was his Purple Heart in Robert's locker. The implications were staggering. How many identities had been shuffled in that war? How many men came back as someone else? How many families mourned the wrong names or loved the wrong people? Katie realized she would never know the complete truth. War had shattered these men into pieces, and they'd reassembled themselves with whatever fragments they could find. Names, memories, identities, all mixed up in the horror and trauma. She stood at the two graves one last time. Thomas, who died as Robert. Robert, who died as Thomas. Or maybe they were Joseph and someone else entirely. The truth was lost in the jungle 50 years ago. As she walked away, Katie made peace with the uncertainty. Her grandfather, whoever he really was, had loved them. That was the only truth that mattered. The names were just labels. The love was real. The recording Katie made of Thomas's confession sits in a safety deposit box. She's written instructions for it to be released 50 years after the last direct family member dies. Someday the full truth will be known, but not while it can still hurt anyone. Sometimes she watches it alone. This elderly man confessing to living another man's life. Each time she notices something new. A tremor in his voice, a look in his eyes, a moment of peace when he finally tells the truth. The Vietnam War ended in 1975, but for men like Thomas and Robert, like Joseph and all the others with shuffled identities, the war never really ended. They brought it home in their confused names, in their borrowed lives, in their children who would never know their real grandfathers' names. And that's the real tragedy of this story, not the identity swap itself, but that war created so many broken men that switching lives seemed like survival. Thomas and Robert were just two casualties among thousands, men who lost themselves so completely that becoming someone else was easier than finding who they used to be. Katie still visits both graves every Memorial Day. She leaves flowers and a small American flag at each. For Thomas, who lived as Robert. For Robert, who died as Thomas. For Joseph Parker, whose medal ended up in a homeless shelter. For all the names lost and swapped and forgotten in a war that scrambled a generation's identity. The last time she visited, she found fresh flowers already there. No card, no identification. Someone else knew. Someone else was keeping the secret. Someone else was mourning names that didn't match the bodies beneath them. Katie never found out who, but she wasn't surprised. Every war has its secrets. Vietnam just had more than most. Men who came back different because they came back as different people entirely. Families who loved strangers. Children who carried the wrong names in their DNA. The recording ends with Thomas's last words to Katie. "Tell them I love them. I don't know if I had the right to, but I loved them with everything I had." Maybe that's enough. Maybe love doesn't need the right name attached to it. Katie likes to think he was right. That love transcends identity. That the man who raised her father was her grandfather regardless of what name he was born with. That family is more than blood or birth certificates. But late at night, she sometimes wonders about the real Robert's lost decades. Where he was, what he suffered, how he survived with no memory of his identity. Did he have moments where he almost remembered? Did he ever see a Mitchell construction sign and feel something stir? She wonders about Thomas's real family, especially Martha, now 86, and the last one alive, who remembers the boy Thomas was before Vietnam. Does she know somehow that her brother lived? Does she feel it in her bones that he survived, just in someone else's skin? Most of all, she wonders how many other Katies are out there. How many grandchildren of Vietnam veterans who've discovered their grandfather was someone else? How many families built on borrowed names? How many graves with the wrong headstones? The Department of Defense estimates 58,000 Americans died in Vietnam. But Katie knows the real number is higher. Men like Thomas died even though they came home. They died as themselves and were reborn as someone else. The Walking Dead with borrowed names. She started a private Facebook group for others like her. Children and grandchildren of suspected identity swaps. They share stories, careful never to use real names or locations. The group has 847 members and growing, each with their own version of Thomas and Robert's story. They call themselves the Inherited Secrets. They share the burden of knowing their family trees have grafted branches, that their bloodlines don't match their names. They debate whether to tell, whether to test DNA, whether the truth matters after so much time. Most decide, like Katie, to let the sleeping ghosts lie. The truth would hurt too many living people to honor the already dead. They carry the secret like their grandfathers carried false identities, a burden that becomes lighter when shared but never fully lifts. The war ended 50 years ago. Thomas died as Robert last year. Robert died as Thomas shortly after. But their story, the story of swapped lives and borrowed names, continues in every family gathering where Katie bites her tongue, in every time she signs her last name knowing it might not really be hers. She's made peace with it mostly. We are who we become, not who we're born. Thomas became Robert completely enough to fool everyone, including himself. Robert forgot he was Robert so thoroughly that being Thomas felt natural. In the end, the names mattered less than the lives lived. But sometimes, usually at 3 a.m. when she can't sleep, Katie plays the recording again. She listens to her grandfather confess to stealing a life, not knowing that life was trying to find its way back to him. She cries for both men, for all the men who lost themselves in that jungle and came back as strangers. The very last thing on the recording, after Thomas thinks Katie has stopped filming, is him whispering to himself, "I'm sorry, Robert. I'm so sorry." Katie now knows he had nothing to apologize for. They were both victims, both survivors, both heroes in their own tragic way. Two men who traded lives without meaning to, who lived each other's destinies, who died in each other's names. And maybe Katie thinks that's the most anyone can hope for from war, to survive, even if you survive as someone else. To love and be loved even under the wrong name. To find peace, even in a borrowed grave. The recording stays in the safety deposit box. The truth stays with Katie. The dead stay dead, regardless of what names are on their headstones. And somewhere in between all these truths and lies, Two old soldiers finally found their peace. Thomas lived Robert's life better than Robert could have. Robert gave Thomas the forgiveness he never knew he needed. They saved each other, destroyed each other, became each other. And in the end, isn't that what brotherhood in war really means? Losing yourself so completely in your unit that individual identity ceases to matter. Katie doesn't have answers. She just has a recording, 2 graves to visit, and a family she loves built on a 50-year lie. It's enough. It has to be enough. Because the alternative, the truth, would destroy more lives than it would heal. The flowers on both graves are fresh when she visits. Someone else is keeping vigil. Someone else knows. Someone else is protecting the secret. Katie suspects it's Jennifer, the daughter Thomas never knew he had. Another guardian of inherited secrets. They've never spoken about it directly, but they leave flowers on alternating weeks. A silent partnership in maintaining a beautiful lie. 2 women protecting a truth too complex for the world to understand, that sometimes we become who we need to be, not who we were born to be. The war ended. The men came home. But they came home as different people. Literally. And their families loved them anyway, never knowing they were loving strangers who'd borrowed familiar faces. That's the final truth. Katie learned from her grandfather's confession. Identity is just a story we tell ourselves and others. Thomas told Robert's story so well he became it. Robert forgot his story so completely he didn't miss it. In the end, we are all just stories. And sometimes in war, the stories get mixed up. Names get swapped, lives get traded, and families get built on the wrong foundations but stand strong anyway. Katie closes the safety deposit box for the last time. 50 years from now, someone will open it and learn the truth. But by then, everyone who could be hurt will be gone. The secret will become history. The lie will become legend. Until then, she'll keep visiting both graves. She'll keep leaving flowers for both men. She'll keep the secret that protects her family from a truth too strange to accept, that their grandfather was exactly who he said he was, and nothing like who he said he was, both at the same time. The last image on the recording is Thomas's face, finally at peace after confessing. He didn't know Robert was alive. He didn't know about Jennifer. He didn't know the letter that would have changed everything sat in his own journal. All he knew was that he'd lived another man's life and tried to live it well, that he'd loved another man's family and tried to love them completely, that he'd carried another man's name and tried to carry it with honor. And in the end, Katie realizes that's all any of us can do. Try to live our lives, borrowed or not, as well as we can. Try to love our families, blood or not, as much as we can. Try to carry our names, real or not, with as much honor as we can. The recording ends. The story ends. But somewhere in hundreds of American families, similar stories continue. Vietnam veterans who aren't who they claim to be, families who don't know they're loving strangers, graves with the wrong names. Katie is just one keeper of one secret. There are hundreds more out there protecting similar truths. They find each other online, in support groups, in whispered conversations at veterans' funerals. They share the burden of knowing that war doesn't just kill bodies, it kills identities, scrambles names, swaps lives. And maybe that's war's cruelest casualty. Not the dead, but the living who don't know who they are anymore. The men who came back as someone else. The families who loved them anyway. The secrets that bind them all together in a web of beautiful, necessary lies. Thomas died thinking he was a fraud. Robert died giving his friend peace. Katie lives, knowing the truth. And somewhere, in a cemetery in Connecticut, 2 headstones mark the wrong bodies. And somehow that feels exactly right. Because in war, everybody loses something. Thomas and Robert just lost themselves and found each other. And maybe that's the best anyone can hope for in the aftermath of that much horror. To find some version of yourself to become, even if it's someone else entirely. The flowers on both graves bloom every spring. Fresh ones appear every week. The secret keepers maintain their vigil, and the dead rest peacefully, finally free from the burden of names that never quite fit, lives that never quite belonged to them, families they never quite had the right to love but loved anyway.